In, I think it was 2007 or somewhere around there, I read an essay or an article in Quadrant, which is, for those of you who don't know, it's probably the most, or the highest profile conservative publication in Australia. It's the publication that John Howard himself endorses, and he spoke at their 50th anniversary, and it's, you know. And in that article, it was written by a couple of people, one of whom is Tom Switzer, who at the time was the opinion editor at The Australian. And it was an interesting piece because it was arguing that the Iraq War was a deeply unconservative war, which is news to a lot of people, I think, given that it was launched by conservatives, for the conservative side of politics in America. It was supported overwhelmingly, I think almost to a person, in Australia on the conservative side of politics and on political discourse. And if you opposed it, you were likely not to be on the conservative side of politics. They pointed out, though, that in the UK, conservatives were more likely to be against the war than Labour voters. Are there no more conservatives? Have I just got it completely wrong? But it awoke in me the desire to explore more fully what conservatism actually meant in a philosophical way, and then consider the way we use it. When we use the term conservative, in our public discourse, what we usually mean is someone who believes ardently in the free market, and that government should not interfere with the market basically at all, and if they have to the minimal extent. And then we talk about social conservatism, which is essentially a set of ideas about what people should believe. And now those two things happen to be contradictory, and that's something I explain in the essay, and we might get there eventually. But actually, neither of those things is conservative in the philosophical sense. Rather, what conservatism is, and to find, it's actually hard to do this. You could pick up a book which collates sort of the great thinkers in the British conservative tradition. I mean, the Russian conservative tradition is something different, but in the British conservative tradition, you can pick up the great thinkers from Burke and Halifax through to Disraeli and Winston Churchill and so on. And really what you get out of that is that conservatism is not an ideology. So it's not pro-market or anti-market or anything like that. Conservatism is what Michael Oakeshott, who's a conservative political philosopher, called a disposition. So let me give you an example that perhaps is not terribly relevant, but I'm going to do it anyway.
We've got a fair bit of time.
Yeah.
So
when I was growing up, you've mentioned Richmond, so let's talk about footy. When I was growing up, I was hugely into footy. I still am, despite all the pain. And
makes you a better person.
It does. I have character. This is something that supporters of other clubs don't understand. And I loved the VFL. When the AFL was introduced, I was livid. I didn't want to see my team play Fremantle. It meant nothing to me. I didn't want to see my team play anyone in Perth, really. That's a long way away, and I'm probably not going. What I wanted was what I felt the VFL was, this institution that had been built up over time and become so ingrained in our social fabric that it was part of us. And here we were, essentially corporatising it, turning it into a national competition. That is a conservative response.
Is another part of the conservative response that you actually eventually have embraced the AFL?
And that's a very good question. So the point about conservatism then is it's not about whether or not I like the VFL. It's about my approach to change. And conservatism is about a belief that society is organic, that it evolves slowly, that it should evolve slowly, and that sudden disruptive change is a bad idea. That evolution is better than revolution. And of course the roots of conservatism lie in the French Revolution and opposition to it. But the question you ask is a good one. What happens when change happens? And here I would say again, the conservative is not a nostalgic. I am a little nostalgic, leave that aside. But the conservative does not seek to resurrect an old order. The conservative, there's a fantastic quote which I use in the book from Quinton Hogg, I think it is, who was one of Churchill's ministers, who said that the role of the conservative is really to oppose the latest heresy on the basis that they support the current order of things. And then, once that heresy becomes part of the order of things, to defend that heresy against the next one.
Exactly.
That is that the conservative is not trying to resurrect the past. They celebrate the present, particularly those aspects of the present that have served us well, that have evolved over time. But when the change happens and it is upon us, they don't seek to wind back the clock. They're concerned only that the change that occurs in society is not unduly disruptive. And so yes, if I wanted to go back to the VFL now, that would not be a conservative course of action. That would be a reactionary, nostalgic course of action. It would have been conservative in 1987 when the West Coast Eagles and the Brisbane Bears, I still laugh when I say that, when they joined the competition, that was a conservative thing to do. But the conservative now would go, well, I mean, it's kind of happened now. What we need to do is manage that as best we can,
Right.
cushion the blow, cushion the impact of the change, but make sure that society retains its organic integrity. A really good example of that is the way that conservatism responded to democracy. Just about no conservative in the world is going to stand up now and say they're anti-democracy. Well, not in the democratic world anyway. Conservatives had a really hard time with democracy when it was first floated.
And it took a very, very long time to take hold
They
in tiny little stages.
Exactly. It was a radical idea. You give the working classes the vote? This is crazy. I mean, these people don't have an education. They're not concerned with things like liberty and governance and these. I mean, what you have is a governing class for that. People who have the appropriate education and experience. If you hand over the reins of power or input into the levers of power, if you hand that over to the uneducated, you're going to get a government that doesn't do things like protect people's liberty. That was the conservative argument. But ultimately it was Benjamin Disraeli, a conservative British Prime Minister, who introduced the working class franchise in Great Britain because the change was going to come. And conservatives recognised, well, this is coming. What we need to do is usher it in a way that's not disruptive.
Which leads to Margaret Thatcher saying there's no such thing as society.
Right.
Society, there are individual actors operating in a market.
There is no such thing as society, there are only individuals. Now, in truth, she said a bit more than that. But it is nonetheless true that in a neoliberal world, society really only is constituted of individuals going about their own individual aims. It's not held together by some overarching understanding of what society should be aiming at or what is good for society or some shared understanding of values or culture. It's not defined by that. The way Hayek put it was to say that the great society is held together really only by activity that is economic. He didn't mean economic in the financial sense, but economic in the sense of people pursuing their own individual aims, not serving this thing, this abstract thing called society.
So you saw, this is one of the reasons, of course, we saw neoliberals arguing against stimulus package bailouts because, clearly it didn't fit the idea of, necessary corrections during the global financial crisis.
In fact, if you watch the US debate, it's fascinating how quickly those things become socialism.
Indeed.
The government wants to do anything, they're communists.
Yes.
There's a reason the debate goes that way, and it's because it proceeds on neoliberal grounds, which is actually what neoliberalism was worried about, that you return to communism and forms of fascism through government involvement in things like the market.
So what's your diagnosis of the state of neoliberalism in the wake of the global financial crisis?
That's a really good question. I think neoliberalism is I mean, remember, this was the dominant political ideology of the last 30 years. And we need to be careful here because neoliberalism in theory is different to neoliberalism in practice. There are things about the financial crisis that occurred not through pure neoliberalism, but actually impure applications of it. An example is neoliberals were very concerned to avoid concentrations of power. That meant they didn't like the idea of mega corporations. Now, clearly we have that. And clearly that was a problem. You have the too big to fail problem, where entities get so big that governments have to bail them out. A neoliberal would say that was not an application of neoliberalism. Nonetheless, the guiding ideological framework, the philosophical understanding that neoliberalism is ultimately, that the market is ultimately our philosophy now. It's not just a phenomenon, it's a philosophy. That, I think, is something that's coming under attack, partly because of the financial crisis. Mm-hmm. The fact that we've been pursuing this kind of approach and things aren't going so well, or it didn't go so well. And even though in Australia we say, what financial crisis? That, you're not saying that in the US, and you're not saying that in Europe, or even in Asia. So that it's under attack from that perspective. But I also think another real challenge that's emerged from it, and here it depends on how seriously you take this challenge, is climate change. Because one of the things that climate change did, or does, is challenge the idea that the market is a sufficient philosophical guide. Climate change, or the concept generally of environmental degradation, is something that it's basically a negative consequence of market operations. So the minute you say, well, this is a problem, you imply that the market is not a sufficient philosophical ideology and that you need something else. It may be a useful institution, but you need politics to intervene. You need political stops on the operation of the market to stop certain things happening, like environmental degradation or like the kind of collapses that we've seen through the financial crisis. Now, my point in the essay about the relationship of this to conservatism is that this understanding of society as essentially a market society and the social changes that that implies is actually deeply unconservative. And so to illustrate this in the simplest way I can think, let's take, this is the example I often use. Was work choices conservative? Well, it was conservative in the way that we talk about it. Conservatives put it forward. It was very conservative. It was very pro-market. So on. I actually think it was, in the philosophical sense, deeply unconservative. Here it was changing quite radically the nature of the relationship between employer and employee.
So it was because it was one big hit? Is that why you think?
Partly, yeah. It was one big hit that struck at institutions. I mean, trade unions are institutions that conservatives should and in the past have valued. We don't think of that because Margaret Thatcher didn't like trade unions. Was Margaret Thatcher being conservative when she introduced quite radical legislation to remove power from trade unions? No, that was a radical act. So my argument is to say that the idea of neoliberalism is not only not the same as conservatism, but is actually, in many important respects, quite different. The opposite, in fact. I don't know what right-wing means either. I know what it used to mean. I mean, it came from the French Revolution. The left wing were the revolutionaries. The right wing were loyal to the regime. Okay, that's probably the most coherent definition of left and right. But unless there are any revolutionaries here, there may be, you're all right wing by that definition. Now, you may not accept that. And there's a fantastic essay which I quote at the start of this by Andrew Kenny, writing in The Spectator, which is, of course, a conservative publication. And he begins, and it's the best opening sentence to an essay I've ever read. Is Osama bin Laden left-wing or right-wing? And then he goes on, what about, I can't remember exactly, but it's like, what about Robert Mugabe? And this sentence is amazing. Who has a more left-wing approach to women's sexuality? Pope John Paul II or Hustler magazine? Really good questions. And he just deconstructs the whole thing. Is it right-wing to love capitalism? Or sorry, flip it the other way. Is it left-wing to hate capitalism like Hitler? Is it right-wing to be violent and cruel like Lenin? Is it left-wing to be internationalist, like McDonald's or the World Trade Organization? And so on and so forth. Is it right-wing to be racist, like the Communist Party of apartheid South Africa, that wanted a white workers South Africa?
So how do we actually then interpret the modern domestic political contest then, say, between the Labor Party and the coalition?
We could probably
Kevin Rudd and...
We could probably call it the Labor Party and the coalition if we had to come up with a label. At least it's accurate.
Do you think there aren't animating ideas on either side?
Well, this is what I'm currently struggling with. Well, because the point that Kenny's making about left and right is because we don't know what these words mean and they've really lost any meaning that they had, what they mean is gangs. My guys and your guys. And we know that we hate you. We may not really know why. We know we hate you. And
sort of a Richmond Carlton match, basically.
A little bit like that, except I know exactly why I hate you.
I've tipped my hand. I'm the other side.
Yes. Yeah. I'll see you on Thursday. Anyway, the point, though, is that ideas have vacated the field here. Teams dominate it, but ideas don't. And so that's why I find it very difficult. Your question, it's a very good question, it's a very hard one to answer. What are the animating ideas of politics now? You could argue that at least the conservative side of politics had adopted an idea in neoliberalism and was acting upon it. But even that's beginning to fray. When I look at Tony Abbott, I don't know how to describe him philosophically. People say he's a very, very conservative leader. Well, I suppose he is in some ways, but he also has quite strong neoliberal inclinations, which I've just argued is not conservative, so I'm kind of not in a position to say he's conservative on that score. When he comes up with a scheme like this maternity leave scheme, people say, well, how's that conservative? Well, it's very conservative. It's family values and all that sort of stuff.
But in its economic basis, it's a sort of almost Whitlamist kind
of
idea, isn't it?
It's intervention in the economy, but that's not unconservative. Could be very conservative. I mean, the conservative, I would argue, should be quite prepared to intervene in the economy in order to maintain the structures of society. His climate change response is fascinating. I don't really know what to make of it. It's neoliberal in the sense that business as usual will not be punished. So go on emitting the way you are. You can even emit more provided you're more productive.
Because it's based on intensity, not straight emissions.
It's emissions intensity, which is basically how much you emit per unit of GDP, rather than emissions. So as long as you emit more and more, but you do it at a rate that is commensurate with your growth, that's fine.
And then you might be punished, but we can't say how much you'll be punished if you move beyond.
And if you go beyond it, then
fined
if you go beyond it, something will happen. Not sure exactly what, but that says that it's neoliberal in the sense that the market should be left to operate, and if it operates as it's currently operating, we're not going to touch it. But then, if you do want to undertake some project to intervene, to cut your emissions, you apply to a fund where you'll get funding to do that. And who makes the decision about what funding you're going to get? Well, presumably the government, which is not only not neoliberal, it's centrally planned economy. That's the government deciding what should and should not get funding on the basis of what will and will not cut emissions. So when this came out, I spent days trying to figure out what this policy was, philosophically. Now, there wasn't actually a lot of conversation about that in our public discourse, because coming back to the point, I don't think we're that interested in ideas. Well, I think people are, but I don't think the public discourse is. It doesn't give it to them, at least. But so I don't know how to assess Abbott yet, and partly he's an opposition leader. That's how to assess him. He opposes. And the Rudd government, I think one of its abiding crises will be the fact that it is not ideologically clear. Kevin Rudd has enormous support in the polls. His approval rating is astronomical. Fell away very quickly. And my reading of that, and I could be wrong, but my reading of that is that that support was broad but not very deep. People were willing to approve, but they were very quick not to approve once something changed. And I think the reason that that approval was fragile is because there isn't a clear idea. Game playing of politics always means you're not going to get pristine applications of ideas. I mean, the world is not a laboratory, and it doesn't work that way. And then there's political compromises that are reached in order to get anything done. Right? I understand that. And the Liberal Party, I guess, has always been one of those things that is tricky because it is built onto political traditions that have sort of become married, but initially were sworn enemies. And that is conservatism and liberalism. Now, liberalism, which I didn't talk about, I should, it's reasonably important. Liberalism is ultimately the idea that the individual is the unit of society that should be protected. So that rather than that government expresses the will of the people, the role of the state and of our institutions is to preserve the liberty of the individual from the tyranny of the majority. And that's an idea that animates our entire structure. We have a balance of powers because of this idea that the state should have a limited role in how much power it can have over people. We have things like freedom of speech and freedom of conscience, if not constitutionally guaranteed, then at least largely in our psyche. That derives from liberalism. Conservatism and liberalism were originally sworn enemies, then socialism came along and they said, hey, you know what? Let's get together. So they did. And so you have a liberal conservative tradition. And at times they pull in opposite directions and you get that sort of distinction. But I think there is something different about that tension being played out in, say, Menzies' time and the way that it plays out now. And that is that within liberalism there is still the notion of, quite a powerful notion of society, of shared culture, of shared values and so on and so forth, as that kind of being the glue that helps the individual liberty thing function. And so conservatives could easily embrace that. But neoliberalism is, I guess, a form of liberalism that's slightly more extreme. And in that extremity, it starts to erode that glue, that social glue. And that's where the distinctions, I think, become starker. And if you want to see how this is played out in the current Liberal Party, you need only look at Tony Abbott, because he's got two heroes. Bob Santamaria, John Howard. Very, very different people. Very, very different views on a lot of things. Bob Santamaria, fierce critic of capitalism, very conservative. Couldn't stand capitalism, probably for that reason. Didn't like the social destruction of it, thought that it compromised values, and was worried about the social inequities that it would unleash and what that might mean. John Howard, fiercely pro-capitalist, work choices being the ultimate expression of that.